quite enough commercials for now. Now it's my great pleasure and honor to welcome back to the live into the Wednesday lecture program Monsignor Timothy Verdon, who needs little introduction to an audience like you guys. However, I will do it. Originally from America, he's been living in Florence for over 50 years, I believe. A very excellent well-renowned art historian who also got heavily involved in the Duomo to the point of taking the cloth and becoming a member of the Curia. So he's a working priest, but also, when he's not doing that, his day job is running the Museo dell'Opera del Duomo. I don't know whether still teaching to Sanford as well, but no, he's given up teaching to Sanford. He was doing that for a while. So he's a very busy man and a good friend to everybody in the city and to them. So Timothy, welcome back and over to you. Thank you.
As they say, the devil is in the details. This is a talk given originally in Italian. I think tonight is its first outing in English, and it is about Bernardo Bontalenti, who, among many other achievements, also designed what was to be the brand new facade of the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore. He was the personal friend of Grand Duke Francis de' Medici, the eldest son of Cosimo I and Eleonora. He was considered the most modern architect of his time. We are in the late 16th century. The facade that you see on the screen is done in 1587. It's not working here. The technical person. It's not advancing. I'm trying to advance it. It's not, you have to do this. Yeah, I found a way. Thank you. Solved the problem. There's a fuller view of it. You're looking at a 6-foot tall presentation model. That's to say, a luxurious and very costly model of what the proposed facade would be like that the architect prepared for his patron, the Grand Duke, to allow the Grand Duke some notion of what he would be paying for. Larger context was, I will say, the Medici interest in updating the medieval cathedral. It was a self-interested venture in that they wanted people, in a sense, to lose the memory that it had been built when Florence was a republic and had been the expression of the energy and fierce civil spirit of that medieval and early Renaissance republic. The new Medici dynasty wanted to give a much more modern and princely air to this church built under other circumstances. Francis authorized in the same year, 1587, the removal of what had been done of the medieval facade. It had never been completed above about a third of the height of the cathedral front. In the Opera del Duomo Museum, we have reconstructed almost all of what it looked like. It's never higher than 20 meters. And we have one big room with a 20-some meter ceiling. and a length almost sufficient to do the entire facade. We rebuilt the medieval facade in order to put the more than 70 works of sculpture that we still have from that medieval facade in their proper places. Sculpture needs to be seen at the intended angle of view, and so our intention in doing the facade was to allow the works of sculpture to speak for themselves. We also have, in another part of the museum, the several very handsome and in most cases very large models made in the years after the dismantling of the decoration of the medieval facade. And the first of those models is this one. This is what Francis wanted and what Montalenti proposed for him. Unfortunately, Francis I died in the same year, 1587. Today it is thought perhaps he was poisoned. His morganatic wife, Bianca Capello, died in the same year. And from the point of view of the Medici family, that was very convenient because they were unable to have children. The family needed someone who could take over and produce heirs. And so Francis's younger brother, Ferdinando de' Medici, who in the manner of the great Italian families had been put into the church as a young man, had been made a cardinal because he was a Medici, but had never been allowed to take ordination because the family said, if your brother doesn't make it, you will have to step in, and therefore we can't have you a priest. If and when your brother actually produces heirs, then you can be ordained. So in 1587, Cardinal Ferdinando is called back from Rome and assumes the throne. 2 years later, he marries a distant relative, a niece of Catherine de' Medici, Queen of France, Christine of Lorraine, and they do a knock-up job. They produce children left and right. And so that part of the story has a very happy ending. When Francis died, though, this model had been produced, and in his funeral narration, one of the achievements of his that gets specific mention is his intention to finally solve the problem of facade. As I said, the medieval one had never been finished, and so it was a bit of an eyesore. They had actually begun to build Montalenti's facade, just the very lowest level. And so this was thought of as one of Francis' achievements. They also mention the fact that he completes the series of very large statues inside the cathedral. And the main reference, the most exciting one, I think, for most people, if they allow themselves to feel excited at the Prince's funeral, was that the defunct ruler had begun to finish the cathedral. Actually, under Francis, some of the siding, the revetment of the sides of the cathedral was completed in the medieval fashion begun in the 14th century. And the whole facade, here you see it in the detail from Stefano Bonsignore's 1584 aerial view of Florence. The whole cathedral was on the way to being finally completed. Now, in that aerial view, you will note, among other things, that the baptistry, of course, stands then, just as it does now, right in front of the cathedral. And one of the themes of my talk this evening is, in fact, the relationship between the medieval baptistry and the new facade that was being planned. I'd like to situate all of the things I'll say in the context of Rome, both because even though Italy was not a united nation, and so Florence was itself a capital, one can say that the influence of Rome was extremely important, especially in ecclesiastical art and architecture, because the period we're talking about is the Catholic Counter-Reformation. In the very years when I start this reflection, the Pope was the gentleman you see here, a Franciscan who took the name Sixtus V, elected in 1585. He would die in 1590. But in those very few years, he built more in Rome than anyone before and anyone after. And this print of the period shows him surrounded by some of the ancient buildings he had repaired, some of the modern ones he had erected. He had long streets made. He was thinking of the Jubilee, the holy year of 1600, which you would never see, but he understood the great crowds of people who would come to Rome needed broader avenues, wanted to see renewed churches. And so everything I say about Florence has to be seen in the perspective of the amazing amount of modern building going on in Rome, not least because part of this story does involve the younger brother, Ferdinando, ex-cardinal, who becomes Grand Duke, but who had spent a long enough period in Rome before becoming Grand Duke to know full well what was going on there and to still have connections and remain interested. Now, both of these brothers, the older one, Francis, and the younger one, Ferdinando, wanted to complete the project of sumptuous modernization in the cathedral that their father, Cosimo I, had begun in the 1540s. The first of Cosimo I's big projects was the altar enclosure, what we call the coro, choir area, not for a singing choir, but for the clergy of the cathedral. If you know the interior of the cathedral, you realize that beneath Brunelleschi's octagonal dome, there is this octagonal space. It once looked like this. This is a model we have in the museum based on prints of the period that shows that above the retaining wall that you still see in the cathedral, that wall along the base of the structure you have on the screen in front of you, there was a colonnade supporting a massive marble architrave and 4 arches, sculpture on the altar, all of this by Cosimo's preferred architect and sculptor, Baccio Bandinelli. Here in the 1540s, what his sons do is in the 1580s. But let me take you back to the 1540s and remind you that while Bandinelli was working on this, which he, and then after his death, others would not complete until 1572, while all of this is being done, the same ruling family is having extensive work done in the medieval town hall. The Udienza, as it is called, the splendid 16th century architecture on the dais, where the Grand Duke's throne was placed in the Salone del Cinquecento on important occasions. This is the room in which he received ambassadors and delegations and what have you. All of that is designed by Bandinelli, and then somewhat later, the magnificent ceiling that I'm sure you know, the drop ceiling basically, hiding the medieval struts of the roof, is done by Vasari. So the Medici invested not only in modernizing the cathedral, but also, and in a sense, to them almost more importantly, the town hall. These were the 2 principal stages on which these princes of a brand new dynasty presented themselves to the world and to their own subjects. And they wanted these stages to be magnificent, modern, to help people forget the more austere republic of the late Middle Ages and 15th century, just as Vasari did that grand ceiling in the Salone del Cinquecento. It was he who was called to finally decorate the introdos, the interior of Brunelleschi's dome. Brunelleschi, of course, built it in the 14 teens through 1436. It had remained without decoration, but whitewashed, until 1572. As Bandinelli's choir was being completed, Vasari was called to decorate, literally in the same year, was called to begin decoration of the dome. Vasari then died in 1574, and the dome would be completed by Federico Zuccari. But I recall these things to you simply to create or recreate for you the sense of the new dynasty really trying to leave its mark on the city with these grand, ultra-modern works that spoke of the insertion of the Medici in the great world, works that in style had something of the grandeur of ancient Rome, and that in feeling had some of the newness of the great works in Rome. Vasari's decoration of the cathedral dome was meant to have features that were clearly derived from Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling, and so on. And as the binary process unfolds in the ceilings, so it did in the buildings, because the same Bandinelli who carved the statue of Pope Leo X, who was the one who had laid the foundations of the Medici dynasty in Florence, Lorenzo the Magnificent's second son. There's the statue at your left. The same Bandinelli would carve above the altar in his new choir enclosure in the cathedral this somewhat clumsy, to be honest, God the Father. Looks as if he's asking if he may leave the room there. But actually, beneath him there was a massive statue of the dead Christ supported by an angel, and so it's God the Father blessing his dead son. And then above them there was a crucifix that is still in the cathedral, Benedetto Maiano, older than the statues. But these two processes are unfolding at about the same time. And just as in the town hall, now the throne room of the prince, at the center of Vasari's grand ceiling, there is that large painted panel with Cosimo I being crowned by fame. So in the dome of the cathedral, Vasari, among many other figures, shows us Cosimo I wearing the Order of the Golden Fleece in a group of saintly rulers. The man with the big crown below him, of course, is Charlemagne. Then you have various others. Excluded from this affair was King St. Louis of France. Behind Cosimo, the younger man, is Francis I, because Cosimo, in the last year of his reign, had actually transferred effective control of the state to his son Francis, even though he retained the title Grand Duke. So this is the context in which we're speaking. And as I say, at Francis I's funeral in 1585, one of the achievements remembered is his plan to complete the facade of the cathedral. In the meantime, though, other things had happened. And so we should look at them. In front of the town hall with its throne room, decorated in modern style, to Michelangelo's David, already placed there in 1504, other statues had been added. Bandinelli's Hercules and Bacchus, Amanati's Neptune, and then Giovanni da Bologna's equestrian statue of Cosimo, paid for by his two sons, Francesco and Ferdinando. What I'm saying is not only the interiors, but also the exteriors of these buildings were beginning to assume a new ducal look. That was true, certainly, of the intention to put up Bontalenti's facade on the cathedral. But the other image that you see in this slide is a building. Some of you may recognize it, but perhaps not, as the Archbishop's Palace, which is just on the other side of the piazza from the cathedral. And so it's part of our story. That had been damaged by fire earlier in the 16th century and was dramatically redesigned by a member of the Medici family who had become archbishop. So it's not quite a brother, but it's a cousin of both Francesco and Ferdinando, Alessandro de' Medici, cardinal, who was made Archbishop of Florence, and immediately gave orders that the damaged archbishop's residence, Palazzo San Giovanni, should be repaired, should be modernized. A Tuscan architect who, like Ferdinand himself, lived in Rome. Ferdinand, when he became archbishop, stayed in Rome. He really preferred life down there. Alessandro stayed in Rome and would not actually come to Florence until the mid-1580s. But the architect called to redesign the palace is one of the other actors in the story this evening. Giovanni Antonio Dosio, Tuscan, who had made his career up to that point in Rome, and he designed the facade under the direction of a Florentine cleric to whom the absentee Archbishop Alessandro de' Medici had left this task, who was Vincenzo Borghini, here in a contemporary sketch by Tadeo Zuccari. Borghini, who was also the learned cleric, actually was a Vallombrosan monk, who had written the iconographic programs of Cosimo I's painted rooms in Palazzo Vecchio, who had written the iconographic program of the inner dome in the cathedral. So this is a man inserted in this whole process that I'm talking about, and he oversees the rebuilding of the palace and oversees even the placing on the palace of the coat of arms of Alessandro de' Medici, who became Pope at the end of his life. It lasted only a month after the election. But for the Medici, what was significant was that another member of the family had become Pope, Leo XI, and his coat of arms are still there and quite visible. So what I'm saying is that just as I showed you a detail of an aerial view of the piazza that helped you relate the facade of the cathedral to the baptistry, let me now show you a slightly lower detail that shows you that at the top you have part of the facade of the cathedral, still the old one. In the middle you have the medieval baptistry, Romanesque baptistry, and then just below it, you have the Archbishop's palace where it then stood. It doesn't stand there any longer because the building just below the baptistry in this angle view from above was demolished at the end of the 19th century to make the piazza bigger. But that was the medieval Archbishop's palace that had been damaged, that had been repaired by Alessandro de' Medici through the agency of the Vincenzo Borghini. And it really meant two things. That the Archbishop lived in that building, whereas the building right below it, which is connected to it, you can see it by a kind of bridge, that building was the office building, the Curia. When the upper building in the late 19th century was demolished, the Archbishop had to move into the Curia, and they shifted the facade designed by Dosio of the palace in the upper area, just below the baptistry here. They shifted that facade to the palace that you see today. I hope that was not entirely unclear. But to make the point more dramatically, since the demolition took place really long after the invention of photography, here is a late 19th century photograph of the Archbishop's palace with the scaffolding going up for its demolition. But you can see how very close it was to the baptistry. And that's part of our story too. It was a smaller piazza in the 16th century than it is today. And that meant that the visual relationship between the sides of the piazza was much more clearly perceptible than it is today. You see that the Archbishop's palace is extended into an undecorated part at the left-hand side. There it continues. From the piazza, you could not then, as you can now, look into Via dei Pecori all the way down to Palazzo Antinori. So it was entirely closed on that side. It was much more closed on the south side. There you see the Loggia del Bigallo with the arches bricked up in the 18th century because there were structural problems. And then you don't see the Misericordia as you do today. You see a medieval tower house and we call it Via dei Calzaioli, the street that goes from Piazza del Duomo to Piazza della Signoria, which then was much narrower. The widening, the 19th century drawing by Burci, the narrowing of these streets happens only in the 1830s. That piazza really was a kind of urban salotto, a room on the east side. You did not have the long view down toward the Palazzo della Legione and Via dell'Oriolo that you have today, because the houses of the cathedral clergy, back at my own house, stuck much further out into the piazza. So the building that you see projecting almost to the side of the bell tower in this 19th century print, which, however, recreates a 17th century painting after Misericordia. That building that sticks out and almost closes the view into the lateral piazza of the cathedral. That is basically where I live now, except that they're taking 2/3 of my apartment because they cut it all back to that straight line of houses that today allows you a long vista. 19th century loved long vistas. And so they removed these buildings that closed the piazza. We're talking about a period when those buildings were still there. And as I say, that means that the whole piazza was much closer in. And the relationship between the facade of the cathedral and the facade of the new Archbishop's Palace, the new facade of the Archbishop's Palace, is one of the crucial features of the things I'm going to say now. The design of Bandinelli's choir enclosure and the design of Buontalenti's facade for the cathedral belong to the same family in that they both, in typical Florentine Mannerist fashion, exaggerate the use of classical elements, rather overcharged, rather overwrought, where in the wood model of the facade, you see wood without coloring, that was to have been in white marble, where, however, you see green, that was to have been the same kind of green protostone that we see on many medieval Florentine buildings, and not only Florentine. A drawing in the Metropolitan Museum actually shows you, it's a drawing again of Buontalenti's design, somewhat modified here in the drawing, but it's the same facade with actually statues in the niches. And you can see the contrast between the white and the green. And we know that the green Prato stone is actually more intense than is shown here in this drawing. Once we realized, though, that Buontalenti's plan was for a facade in the colors of the sides of the cathedral and of other important buildings in Florence, San Miniato al Monte, the facade of Santa Maria Novella, and so on, it becomes clear that Buontalenti's plan was to harmonize the new facade with the most historic building in the piazza, which of course is the baptistry. The baptistry was seen as the primary historic component of the piazza. People understood that it was only legend, but they still liked to think that the baptistry had been built in ancient Roman times and only later transformed into a Christian church, receiving in the Middle Ages the decoration that we see. So the idea was that the new facade should be in perfect accord with the baptistry, and that was a lovely idea. But the problem was now the new Archbishop's Palace so close behind the baptistry. And it was a problem in terms of style, because Buontalenti's idea for the facade of the cathedral was for a 3-level front with this abundance of surface columns and niches and all of this. Whereas Dozio's design of the facade of the Archbishop's Palace, and this is actually a photograph of that palace before it was demolished in the 1890s, Dozio's design of the palace was in the more modern Roman style, that synthesize a multiple story building into what are often called colossal or gigantic orders. What I mean that you actually see 4 stories in that photograph of the palace, but you read it as an enormous 2-story building, because the actual presentation of the building is in 2 horizontal segments, which are emphasized not only by the horizontal band going around the facade in the middle there, but also by the corner pilasters, which define 2 distinct levels. What I'm saying is that to a 16th century eye, Buontalenti's plan for the facade would not have harmonized with the more modern colossal order of Dozio's Archbishop's Palace, and the buildings were much closer than today we see the cathedral facade in the Archbishop's Palace. Dozio, as I said, had worked in Rome. The 2-story notion of buildings had been developed by the most modern Roman architects. Here's an elevation of Vignola's facade of the Villa Giulia in 2 grand stories. Actually, behind the front rooms, there are about 6 stories in that building, obviously. And the most famous example of the new Roman style was Michelangelo's Campidoglio, which actually was still being completed in the years when Ferdinando de' Medici, the young cardinal brother, lived in Rome. Those buildings, the 2 parallel buildings on the Campidoglio, have a 2-story presentation. Again, in the depth of the building, you have 5 different stories. But the idea is to project a vision of grandeur on the front. In this case, there's a single level column that defines the height of the building, and then the 2 stories made evident. This was considered much more modern, much more grand, much more noble. And so when, after Francis's death in 1587, his brother Ferdinando takes over everything, he dislikes Buontalenti's facade. He finds it rather old-fashioned, and he calls the same man who had done the Archbishop's Palace a few years earlier, Giovan Antonio Dozio, to do a model of the cathedral facade. And we have that model too in the Opera del Duomo Museum. And the first thing that I think you see fairly clearly is that Dozio has used the same system that Michelangelo did on the Campidoglio, colossal pilasters on the ground floor level that actually dissemble the 2 distinct levels that are made evident, the 3rd level as well. But you really read this more as a 2-story structure than as the 3-story structure that Buontalenti had given. And my point, obviously, is that Ferdinando the First, who becomes Grand Duke in the year of his brother's death, 1587, is thinking about the new building on the opposite side of the piazza. He wants the new cathedral facade to harmonize with Dozio's palazzo. And here, prepared images, I think, give you some notion of what I believe Grand Duke Ferdinando had in mind. If you have some difficulty following what I'm saying here, let me remind you of 2 famous Quattrocento paintings showing ideal city views. The upper one is in Urbino, the lower one is in Baltimore in the United States. They are both simply called ideal city views. They both show handsome 15th century Renaissance piazze, but the relationships between the city and the piazza are different. In the upper view, you don't know who did these, sometimes say Lorenzo Laurana, in the distant past, they used to be attributed to Piero della Francesca. And it's true that the perspective, the lighting, and the feeling is related to his art, but they're not about Piero. However, what interests us is the 2 concepts of the city. In the upper view, you have a modern city with handsome Quattrocento buildings. You have a beautiful piazza in perfect perspective, but in the middle of the piazza, you have a beautiful church. It's really the kind of thing that I think Francesco had in mind in having Bontalenti perfectly harmonize the facade of the cathedral with the baptistry. You have a piazza, but it is dominated by a great work of art, believed by many who go back to ancient times. So there, precedence is given to the monument in the center, whereas in the lower city view, there are monuments. There's a Colosseum. There's what looks like the Florentine baptistry, more or less. There's a triumphal arch, but they're all on the side. Pride of place is given to the piazza itself. And so where the upper view is like a museum installation, where you have the most important work in the center, because you're focusing on that important work. It's the masterpiece protagonism. In the lower view, it's really the city that interests us. There are great works, but they become part of the urban fabric. And I put it that way. I speak of a museum installation because in the same years that we're talking about, in the 1580s, Bernardo Bontalenti added a room to Vasari's Uffizi for Francis I, and it is a remarkably beautiful octagonal room known as the Tribuna. Here you see a modern photograph. The most prized works of ancient and modern art were kept in this sumptuously decorated room. What you don't see in our modern slides, because it no longer exists, is a work by Giovanni da Bologna, famous in its day, which was later dismantled, a steeple, that was the name given to these huge chests with inlaid Pietro Serena on the drawers and doors into little cabinets where precious objects were kept. And contemporary sources tell us it stood right in the center of this room, and it was at least 5 or 6 meters tall. So what I'm saying is in the center of the new museum installation in the Uffizi, done by Bontalenti for Francis, who was an avid collector of curiosities, which would have been in that enormous steeple. The arrangement was somewhat similar to the upper ideal city view that you have here. My point is that Francis was interested in the great works, not the city. Ferdinando, we're going to say, is interested in the city. Ferdinando was not a collector. Ferdinando was, may I say it, an urbanist. It is Ferdinando de' Medici in the late 16th and early 17th century who organizes the enlargement of the city of Livorno, the Grand Duchy's important Mediterranean port. And he doesn't want precious historic works in the center. He wants a functioning city that can communicate its own dignity as city. And so let me again remind you of Rome. There at your right is the Campidoglio, which was being finished while Ferdinando was a young cardinal down there in the Eternal City. And there is the completed Piazza Santissima Annunziata, the Ospedale degli Innocenti by Brunelleschi at your right. At your left, the Servite housing unit built in the early 16th century to mirror Brunelleschi's Ospedale degli Innocenti. And then at the back of the slide, you have the, again, almost mirror image of the other two facades created at the very end of the 16th century and the beginning of the 17th under Ferdinando by the Medici family. And then at the center, you do have the equestrian monument, just as at the center of the Campidoglio. You have the ancient equestrian monument of Marcus Aurelius. The one in Piazza Santissima Annunziata is Ferdinand himself by Tacca. And the monuments are there but they are completely subordinate to the urban space. It is the urban space that impresses us, not the handsome equestrian monument. This is also the moment when an equestrian monument is erected in Piazza della Signoria. Giovanni da Bologna did earlier, completed the monument to Cosimo I, paid for, again, we said, by both Francesco and Ferdinando. So they're conscious of the messages that these statuary groups, these equestrian monuments, should communicate, but they want the message of the prince's power to be subordinate to the larger message. Ferdinand does want him to be subordinate to the larger message of the city itself. And so in Piazza Signoria, in fact, they did not choose a central position for Gian Bologna's monument to Cosimo. He's in line with the other statues, kind of chorus line, doing a cakewalk there at one end of the piazza. At all events, these two very different views of how you deal with an important urban space really have never been discussed before, since, as I say, the Museo dell'Opera del Duomo has these handsome models and also has the reconstructed unfinished medieval facade. It made sense for me to talk about these things at that conference and this evening, first time in English. And I think it's a footnote, if you like, but a very interesting one, a long one, in the history of that period and in the urban history of Florence. Let me finally show you the two brothers. There at your left, of course, you have eccentric and rather melancholic Francis, and then his much better fed, much more generally relaxed younger brother. The church helps people relax. Had Ferdinand remained in Rome, I'm sure he would have had even more relaxation visible in his body. But they're very different men. Francesco, this eccentric collector who dabbled in alchemy and other arcane sciences. Ferdinando, the ex-churchman who married and had a successful marriage with Christine of Lorraine, produced the next generation, a new dynasty that would last until 1734 or 7, when he's just going to die. I have to remember that. And as I say, the one a collector turned into his own interests, the other genuine head of state who thinks of the interests of the state, who wants to create in Florence a handsome capital that could compete on the smaller scale with the Rome of Sixtus V and his successors. Keeping your eye on Ferdinand there, you may be surprised to know that shortly before he died, he accepted the offer of an English adventurer, a man named Robert Thornton, to go to the New World and locate land that the Grand Duchy of Florence could take over as a colony. The idea was that Thornton would go to South America and find land from which they could import rare wood. Tuscany has always been known for its forests, for its wood industry, for the making of superb wood decoration and furniture in the 16th century. The idea was that they would acquire a colony really where French Guiana now is and import wood. Thornton left from Livorno on his ship, small flotilla, in 1608. When he returned about a year and a half later, Ferdinando was no more. He had died in the meantime. The whole project came to naught. It really, though, would have been the only Italian state to have a New World colony. That did not happen. After Ferdinando's death, he was succeeded by his son Cosimo, would become Cosimo II, There you see him on a coin minted shortly after his accession to the throne. He, in a sense, was part of this story because for his marriage a few years earlier, they had to decorate the never finished facades. Bontalenti's and Dozio's facades never got built on important state occasions. They put up stage scenery in front of the facade. In his case, we think that was what was erected by Cigoli, another artist, probably looked a bit like the Dozio project that had never even been begun. You say, why was it never begun? Ferdinando remained Grand Duke until 1608. Why didn't he begin the facade? He was very respectful of what Florentines thought. And so after he had Dozio do the modern facade that you have seen inside, that you see again in a moment, he asked people, what do you think? And that's when the wheel formed, because he lived in Rome. He didn't know his native Florentines, of whom it is still said at times, they have a very good eye and a very bad tongue. He encountered the hypercriticism of the Florentine intellectual community, and rather than begin something that everyone was ready to condemn, he simply put it off, put it off. Son was not interested. When Cosimo II was married, as I said, they did a mock-up facade that probably looked either like Dozio or like the similar colossal order facade by a member of the Medici family, Don Giovanni, an illegitimate son of the family, whoever was included in the life of the court, and we have that model also. We then, and at the museum, have the later models. There's one at your left, made by the Accademia del Disegno, because poor Ferdinand said, all right, you don't like my facade, you show me the kind of facade you want. Immediately went back to the three-level facade. That one at the left clearly is a design formulated by a committee. It is very, very weak. Then there's a much finer facade by Silvani at your right, which actually has Ferdinando's name at the top, but that was never realized either, because money was starting to run out. The Medici had renounced commerce when they became princes, and that allowed them a few generations of residual great wealth, Elon Musk type wealth. And then they had to start pinching just a bit. Finally, as you may remember, the frontless cathedral was given a facade in 1689 on the occasion of the marriage of the eldest son of Cosimo III, Gran Principe Ferdinando, who died before his father and so never became Grand Duke. But in 1689, he married Princess Violante of Bavaria, and the facade could not be left bare for that occasion. The first idea at that time was again to call stage decorators to cover it with wood struts and painted canvas. And then they say that will cost a fortune in any case. Why don't we call fresco masters? And they do. They call stage designers from Bologna to actually paint a frescoed facade. And here's an 18th century print showing what that looked like. That facade would remain until the mid-19th century. The earliest daguerreotype photographs of the facade of the cathedral show you the rather tired remains of this late 17th century facade after almost 2 centuries of summer heat and sun and winter rain and what have you. And then, as you know, we got Emilio de Fabri's neo-Gothic facade, and a style that I like to, among friends, call railroad Gothic. That's really all I have to say this evening. I hope gave you if you'd be interested in information. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Timothy. As always, a complete tour de force. So I'll just find some lights. So,
Go here.
yeah. Okay, and as always, we'll now move to the question and answer. But before we do that, I just want to thank tonight's sponsor, Christopher Hyder, who's joining us. I hope some up down the Zoom. Are you there, Christopher? Thank you very much for sponsoring tonight's lecture. Thank you. Now, usual rules for question and answer. If you want to ask a question in the room, put your hand up and I'll bring you the microphone. That way the Zoomers can hear you. If you're on the Zoom and you want to intervene, you can unmute and talk to us. We always like to hear your voices. Or else you can put something in the comments and I'll read it out from your behalf. You can open up the chat so I can see what's going on then. I think there is. Okay, so who would like to go first? One at the back.
This is a bit of a cheat, really, because it's not a question, Senior Verdon. It's simply that the opportunity to say we all owe you an enormous debt of gratitude for the fabulous, fabulous work on the Museo dell'Opera del Duomo and the absolutely breathtaking presentation of the Paradiso between the bronze doors and facade. Every time you go into it, you're just overcome with how brilliant it is. So as a piece of museum work, I just wanted to say an enormous thank you on behalf of everybody.
Thank you. There you go. Okay. I feel excited. Who's next? Here we are.
So thank you, Monsignore, for yet another great talk. I have a question about the demolition of the Archbishop Palace. You said it happened in the 1890s. So am I right in thinking that it had nothing to do with Giuseppe Poggi's plans for the Firenze Capitale?
In a broad sense, it fit into the project whose person and actor is Giuseppe Poggi. Poggi's principal contribution is the contour. So where the walls had been, he creates the alley, and that really changes the city forever. And then other projects like Piazzale Michelangelo and so on. But he was certainly part of the group that also wanted to replan the historic center. They did, but not Poggi in person, redesign what had been the Roman Forum and then the medieval market, and which has become Piazza della Repubblica, more than doubling its size, completely demolishing a medieval neighborhood. Marvelous 19th century photographs of the last weeks before the actual demolition began, in which it was carnival, and the Florentines dressed up as Arabs, and they saw these narrow medieval streets in that part of the town that was about to be demolished as similar to North Africa, and so they were playing the Kasbah, but it was a fairly cavalier spirit in which they tore down a lot of stuff, and some of you may remember a book of photographs, but also text by Artusi, in which on the cover he had the great triumphal arch in Piazza Repubblica, and with the phrase, da secularis valore, the city is reclaimed from centuries of squalor by the building of these 19th century things. It's a destruction of Florence in the late 19th century. That's the real title. So one of the things that they wanted to do was actually cut the neck, what was now Piazza Repubblica, into the center of a covered mall like the one in Milan, the Galleria, which could have been approached by the streets that now lead into Piazza Repubblica, but also they would have cut diagonals, allowing you to move from Piazza del Duomo, from behind the baptistry, on a diagonal into Piazza Repubblica, and then continue to Santa Trinita. And all these things are worked out in full detail and drawings and telling. And so it could have been much worse.
That's a good story. No, there's some stuff in the comments. So, from Diane Archibald, thank you for a most interesting presentation on urban space funds. From an architectural perspective, I enjoyed the spatial relationships in comparison between Michelangelo's Piazza Pandoglio and Piazza Santissimo Annunziata, the 1 point perspective. So that's a comment, not really a question. And you'll also see Sarah's put up the weekly reminder to make the donations, so please do that. Now, I think it's going to come through Zooms. They could come through the Zooms. No, but we make donations afterwards. No. I don't think it's going to last forever. Right, any more in the room? So I think people have been overwhelmed by the comprehensive and erudite nature of your talk, sir.
I thought they were prepared for a podcast. I put ladder to the front.
No, it was very rich, an awful lot to think about. I certainly see parts of it very differently now, so thank you for that. Okay, so thanks very much once more to Chris Howard for the sponsorship. Thanks, Timothy, for a wonderful evening. Please come back to the next show. Good night. Thank you. And now, as always, for those who are here with us in France, we move next door for a nice glass of wine from our season sponsors, Poggio Prosecco.